guys, so we're going to be doing something a little different today. We are doing a tour of an old graveyard, and there's going to be true stories taken right out of newspapers. So yeah, it should be fun. There's many of them. There's a gentleman that are going to read from it. And yeah, this is the last day that they're going to have this. They've been running for 7 years, or excuse me, they've been running for 11 years. We'll catch you when it starts going.
Friends, neighbors, fanciers of the macabre, welcome to this, our 11th year, and today our final tour. The Murder, Mayhem, and Madness tour of Forest Home Cemetery. I will say it's very humbling to see such a turnout. I do think this is probably our best Sunday turnout. You should have been here earlier. The place was dead. I want to tell you that the founding of Forest Home Cemetery dates to September of 1871, when Carpenter C. Merritt's 3-year-old son, Vernie, succumbed to scarlet fever. Mr. Merritt chose a burial site atop the highest hill of a tract of property which he owned on the southern edge of town, overlooking 3 lakes. Inspired by the parcel's undulating terrain and beautiful vistas, he set out on a tour of the eastern state's most elegant cemeteries to gather ideas for the development of his land. Upon his return, Mr. Merritt laid out burial plots and created walkways and drives throughout the cemetery. This Forest Home Cemetery is believed to be patterned after Mount Hope Cemetery in Rochester, New York. Now, as I regale you with true tales, you may find my speech dramatic. You may find my words insensitive. But rest assured, the stories I present to you this day are spoken as they were written in the news sources of that time. Our tour today is a walking tour, and some of you may be curious about traversing over the deceased. I assure you, they do not mind. Nor is it considered in polite society to be rude. As you can see, the leaves have fallen quite a bit on the ground, which makes traversing across these grounds a little more dangerous. I invite you to proceed slowly and with caution. Now, as always on our tour, we will let death be our guide. The Detroit Free Press, July the 2nd, 1904. Mrs. Albertine Z. Tompkins was struck by a downbound Jefferson Avenue car while crossing Grand River Avenue between High and Cherry Streets, and received injuries from which she died at Grace Hospital 3/4 of an hour later. From the story of Andrew Rudolph, trainer of the Detroit baseball team, who was an eyewitness of the accident, it appears that Mrs. Tompkins was crossing the street from the west to the east side, and seeing the car coming, she hesitated for a moment until it was directly upon her, and then she stepped in front of the fender and was rolled under the wheels, being dragged nearly 100 feet. Jacks had to be brought from the car barns, and the car lifted before the body could be extricated. Grace Hospital ambulance was soon on the scene, but the woman died 5 minutes after reaching the hospital. Mrs. Tompkins' injuries consisted of a fracture of the left leg near the hip, a fracture of the skull at the left temple, and a deep wound under the right earlobe. She was otherwise badly bruised. Mrs. Tompkins was for many years a citizen of Greenville, much loved by those who knew her intimately and highly respected by all. At the scene, a review of the skid marks indicates Mrs. Tompkins was more scared than the driver. Do you know, by chance, which vehicles get in the most accidents? Well, a Dodge Ram, of course. 1884 Greenville Independent. Dorosny Starkweather came to his death Thursday of last week under most distressing circumstances. He was foreman of F.M. Wright and Company's mill near Stanton at Hemingway Lake. In the morning, before working hours, he was filing a saw, standing in its front with left foot on the track at work. The sawyer went downstairs and turned the steam into the pipe which supplies the power for the steam feeder. Through some defect, the valve was a little off-center and hence emitted some steam into the cylinder, so that the feeder machinery instantly started the log carriage swiftly toward the saw. The left leg of Starkweather was caught between the blocks of the carriage and the guide of the saw and cut, so that it was nearly severed below the knee. The nervous shock was so great and the loss of blood so much that it was doubtful whether the sufferer could survive such a draft on his vitality. Amputation was a necessity, and the leg was amputated above the knee after stimulants had been given and chloroform administered. But death soon ensued. You might not know, but a lumber mill is a risky business. Sometimes you have to go out on a limb. Mr. Dorosny never saw it coming. My name's Christopher, and it might give us a surprise I don't really talk like that. Sorry for breaking character so early in the tour, but this particular story has some personal significance for me. About 11 years ago, my neighbor, Elizabeth, she introduced me to this beautiful location and shared with me stories that she and her friends had dug up. A little while after that, she came to me with this idea that she wanted to do a Halloween tour based on some of the more scandalous stories that her and her friends had dug up. And she asked me if I would be willing to wear a top hat, a trench coat, and she gave me one story to read. My friend Elizabeth died this year. And that's why this is the last year. And this is the story she asked me to read. I'm happy to tell you that after I read this story the next year, she asked if I would just do the whole tour myself. And now you're stuck with me. The 11th of April, 1900, the Greenville Independent. For the companionship of snakes, Professor Percy Sellis sacrificed his wife, children, and the society of his species. Death was the penalty of his infatuation. Not even in the throes of death did his infatuation weaken. The viper that had poisoned him was still nearer to his heart than any other living thing. And his last words were, "Poor Joe, he doesn't know what he's done." His weird fad gradually estranged him from humanity. The time came when even his wife fled from her home. "I am tired of making a bed for snakes," she said just before her departure. Cut off from the income his father had allowed him, Professor Sellis became schoolmaster in Greenville. From Florida came the moccasin that encompassed his master's death. Sellis, in the winter, often allowed it to share his bed with him. The other day, while lifting his moccasin from its cage, he inadvertently squeezed its tail. The snake struck in between the knuckles of his left hand, injecting a full dose of venom. Sellis dropped it and ran for a doctor. Then, remembering that the snake was a danger to others, he returned to confine it. By that time, the poison had taken possession of him. Believing that the bite of a cobra would counteract that of a moccasin, he seized one of the former species, held it near his throat, and tried to provoke it into fastening its fangs into him. But the cobra refused his bait. At once, Mr. Sellis made his way to see Dr. Morgan and to secure treatment. Drugs and stimulants were given. Other physicians, men and women volunteered as nurses. Great interest and sympathy was felt throughout the community, and large numbers of people visited the locality. Too many, we regret to confess, moved by idle curiosity. Messages were frequently sent out, reporting the case to the faithful watchers. As a rule, one dies from snake venom in 8 to 10 hours. For 3 days, he lingered in agony, swollen and discolored beyond recognition. Every known antidote was tried, but the moccasin's poison prevailed. While at Greenville teaching, Percy's favorite subject, of course, was history. Mecosta County, where Marvin has been in business. Everything appeared to the outside world to move harmoniously in their domestic circle until in June last, when Mr. Roosevelt and wife were making a visit. They found Mrs. Marvin in dangerous illness. Lest she should die, she made some verbal directions about the disposal of her property, saying she had made provisions for her children, one an infant, Charles, a week or 2 old, the other a boy, Albert, by a former husband. She also told her mother that her husband had maltreated her and her infant in their helplessness, threatening to execute terrible threats unless she signed over her property to him. She had lands in Nebraska in value amounting to about $3,000. Mrs. Marvin died during the Roosevelt's visit and was buried, the husband manifesting little emotion of the event, even remaining away at a neighbor's until the time for the funeral. After the return home of Mr. and Mrs. Roosevelt, in a short time they received a letter from Marvin that the infant Charles had sickened and died, just as his mother. He afterwards wrote that he would soon see Mr. Roosevelt and settle the affairs of the estate. Mr. Roosevelt having taken charge of the older child of Mrs. Marvin, Marvin wrote other letters postponing his coming. As Mr. Roosevelt was reading one of these letters, a friend direct from Millbrook informed him that Marvin had sold his property at great sacrifice and disappeared. Then suspicion of foul play was first aroused. 6 September 1871, Greenville Independent. The body of Mrs. Marvin was disinterred August 31st, and a post-mortem examination made by a coroner's jury. Dr. Hubbard and another physician of that locality gave professional opinions on the subject. We extract the following from the verdict of the jury. We, the undersigned jurors, do give in a verdict that Sophia Marvin did come to her death by arsenic poisoning. According to the evidence given, John Marvin, her husband, gave her the poison. It is today not known where Mr. Marvin had gone, but he was anxious to go. Why did John Marvin cross the road? To get to the cyanide. So we've talked venomous and we've talked poisonous. Often people confuse the two. But here's a little trick to remember, okay? If it bites you and you die, that's venomous. If you bite it and you die, that's poisonous. If it bites you and it dies, that's voodoo.